Good evening, America. Last night, Donald Trump made two of the most consequential phone calls of his presidency. He called Benjamin Netanyahu twice in the span of a few hours in the middle of the night, on the edge of the worst military escalation this war has produced. The first call, Netanyahu pushed back. He was resistant. He insisted Israel had to respond to Iran's attacks on its cities. He told Trump Israel had no choice. Trump told him to limit the response, to avoid escalation, to hold back from the massive retaliatory strike on Tehran that Israel's military was actively preparing. Netanyahu did not immediately agree, so Trump called again. And this time, it worked. Netanyahu announced afterward that Israel had halted attacks on Iran for now. Schools across Israel are closed today. Israeli children are not in classrooms this Tuesday morning because their government does not yet know whether the missiles will come back. And the question of whether last night's two phone calls actually stopped a wider war or merely delayed it by a few hours is the most important question in the world right now. Tonight, we are going to tell you everything that happened in the last 24 hours. The worst escalation since the April ceasefire. Two phone calls that changed the course of a war. And what happens next when Israel says halted for now, which means it is not over. Stay with me. Because last night was historic. Let us start from where yesterday's video left us and walk through every development in sequence, because the chain of events is critical to understanding what this moment actually means. Yesterday, Iran fired 10 ballistic missiles at northern Israel. People ran to shelters. Patients were moved to underground parking garages at Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv. The world watched and waited to see how Israel would respond. Trump called Netanyahu the first time and urged restraint. Netanyahu was resistant. In that first call, Netanyahu insisted Israel had no choice but to respond. Trump urged him to limit any response and avoid further escalation. And Netanyahu did respond. The IDF struck military and economic targets inside Iran. Israel hit a petrochemical complex in southwest Iran. Israeli warplanes struck what the IDF described as military targets across Iran. Israel hit Beirut's southern suburbs again, targeting what it called Hezbollah infrastructure. And then Iran escalated further. After Israel's retaliatory strikes on Iran, Iran fired additional missiles at Israel, multiple barrages. Iran launched what Israeli officials described as the worst escalation since the April truce. Israel's air defense systems worked through the night, intercepting incoming projectiles. Air raid sirens screamed across Israeli cities. Passengers at Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv were photographed sheltering in place during an Iranian missile attack. Missile fragments landed in the West Bank. The fighting that both governments had been calling a ceasefire for weeks was, in the space of 24 hours, the most intense combat exchange this war had produced in months. And that is when Trump called Netanyahu the second time. The second phone call is the one that changed everything, at least for tonight. By the time of the second call, Israel was reportedly preparing a significant attack on Tehran, not on military infrastructure in the south of Iran, on Tehran, Iran's capital. A strike on Tehran would have been a qualitative escalation beyond anything this war had produced since the opening strikes of February 28th. A strike on Tehran would have been a declaration that the ceasefire was over, that the peace process was finished, and that the war was entering a new and far more devastating phase. Israel was ready. The IDF had prepared the operation, and Trump called and told Netanyahu not to do it. This time, Netanyahu agreed. He announced in a video statement that Israel had halted attacks on Iran for now. He acknowledged that Iran had attacked Israel in support of Hezbollah following Israel's retaliatory strikes on Hezbollah in Beirut. He said he had directed the IDF to strike military and economic targets throughout Iran. And then he said the words that are holding the fragile peace together tonight. Halted for now, not stopped, not ended, not stood down. Halted for now. And he added with equal clarity, the fight against both Tehran and Hezbollah is not over, and Israel will continue to respond to any attacks on its territory. Israel's education minister Yoav Kish posted on social media explaining that schools would remain closed on Tuesday to enable a day for organization and reconnecting with students, with the intention of returning to what he called frontal learning under a protected framework on Wednesday. Frontal learning under a protected framework. That is how an Israeli education minister describes school in a country that spent Sunday and Monday night under ballistic missile attack. Israeli children are at home today not because of a holiday, but because their government is not yet certain the missiles have stopped. Now let us talk about what Iran said today, because Tehran's response to the two Trump-Netanyahu phone calls is as important as the calls themselves. Iran said Monday that the United States holds responsibility for what has happened, not just Israel. America. Iran is drawing a direct line between American support for Israel, American weapons supplied to Israel, American diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations, and the Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. Tehran is saying that America's role as Israel's partner in this war makes America responsible for everything Israel does. That is a significant escalation in Iran's diplomatic and rhetorical positioning, and it has direct implications for the peace deal that is supposedly still alive and being negotiated. Because here is the paradox at the heart of tonight's situation. Trump spent Sunday and Monday night making urgent phone calls to stop Israel from hitting Tehran in order to preserve the possibility of an Iran-U.S. peace deal. Iran is simultaneously saying America is responsible for what Israel did. The country Trump is trying to make peace with is accusing Trump's country of responsibility for the attacks Trump himself tried to stop. That is the impossible position America's diplomacy now occupies. Trump is simultaneously restraining Israel and being blamed by Iran for Israel's actions. He cannot satisfy both parties by doing either. There is something else that happened this week that most American media is not covering, but which deserves attention tonight because it reveals a deeply human dimension of this conflict. Iran's national soccer team is traveling to Mexico for the World Cup. The team arrived at Antalya Airport in Turkey for their departure to Mexico. The federation's president, Mehdi Taj, faced uncertainty over whether he had been issued a visa. Iran's participation in the World Cup has been complicated by the war. Problems processing visas had already forced Iran to move its training base from Tucson, Arizona to Tijuana, Mexico, just across the California border. Iranian soccer players are preparing for the world's most watched sporting event while their country is firing ballistic missiles at Israel, and their foreign minister is describing peace negotiations as making no tangible progress. Ordinary Iranian people, athletes, families, students are trying to live normal lives inside a country that is simultaneously at war with the United States and Israel. That human reality is rarely part of the American coverage of this conflict. It is part of the story. Let us now step back and look at where the peace deal stands after the most violent 48 hours of this war in months. Because despite everything that happened Sunday and Monday, the diplomatic process has not completely stopped. Pakistan's Interior Minister Mohsen Naqvi visited Iran on Saturday for talks with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, according to Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency. That visit happened before the latest exchange of strikes. Pakistan's mediators were in Tehran on Saturday. And now, after Sunday and Monday's escalation, the question is whether those talks can survive what just happened, or whether the exchange of strikes has blown up whatever fragile progress Islamabad had made. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi had said just days ago that no tangible progress had been made on the peace deal. The U.S. and Iran are still separated by the fundamental question of whether sanctions relief comes before or simultaneously with nuclear commitments. Iran still demands $24 billion in frozen assets. Trump has said Iran will not get sanctions relief for surrendering its nuclear material. The Strait of Hormuz is still under Iranian management. The IAEA still cannot get inspectors inside Iran. And the Lebanon question, the one that has blocked the deal from being signed for weeks, just got dramatically worse after Sunday's exchange of strikes in Beirut and northern Israel. Here is the Lebanon picture as of tonight, because it connects everything that happened in the last 24 hours and tells you why the ceasefire is now in its most fragile state. Israel struck Beirut's southern suburbs on Sunday in retaliation for what it described as Hezbollah attacks. Iran then fired missiles at Israel in response to the Beirut strikes. Israel then struck military and economic targets across Iran in response to those missiles. And the chain reaction that every diplomat in the world has been trying to prevent for weeks played out in less than 24 hours. The mechanism of escalation is now visible and documented. Israel strikes Lebanon. Iran retaliates against Israel. Israel retaliates against Iran. Iran retaliates against Israel again. And at each step of that chain, Trump is on the phone trying to break the cycle, while Iran blames America for starting it. Hezbollah's continued rejection of the Lebanon ceasefire framework is the single most important unresolved structural problem in this entire peace process. As long as Hezbollah refuses to accept ceasefire terms, Israel will continue to strike Hezbollah targets. As long as Israel strikes Hezbollah, Iran will respond against Israel. As long as Iran fires missiles at Israel, Israel will retaliate against Iran. And as long as Israel retaliates against Iran, the Iran-U.S. peace deal cannot be signed, because Tehran insists that the ceasefire covers all fronts, including Lebanon. This is not a negotiating problem. It is a structural loop. And the only way to break the loop is for either Hezbollah to accept a ceasefire or for Israel to stop striking Lebanon. Neither of those things appears likely tonight. Now, let us talk about what Trump's 2 phone calls actually accomplished and what their limits are, because America deserves an honest assessment of what the president achieved last night and what remains unresolved. What Trump accomplished is genuinely significant. He prevented a massive Israeli strike on Tehran. That strike, if it had happened, would almost certainly have produced an Iranian response of a scale and severity that would have made Sunday and Monday look minor. A strike on Tehran's government and military infrastructure could have killed senior Iranian officials, including potentially the new supreme leader. It could have triggered an Iranian response that hit American targets directly and at a scale that would have forced Trump to choose between absorbing the hits or declaring full-scale war resumed. Trump's phone calls bought time. They preserved the possibility, however fragile, that the peace process can continue. That is not nothing. That is significant. What Trump did not accomplish is equally important to understand. He did not end the cycle of escalation. He delayed it. Netanyahu said halted for now. An Israeli official said there will be a response, even if not immediate. Israel has never absorbed missile attacks on its cities without ultimately responding, and it will not do so now. The next Israeli action against Iran, when it comes, will restart the escalation cycle unless a ceasefire framework is firmly in place. And right now, a firm ceasefire framework does not exist. What exists is a pause held in place by 2 late-night phone calls from Donald Trump. And here is what needs to happen in the next 48 hours if that pause is to become something more durable. Iran and the United States need to get back to the negotiating table through Pakistan or Qatar and produce a memorandum of understanding that both sides can actually sign. That memorandum needs to include language on Lebanon that Hezbollah can accept, or at minimum, that Iran can present to Hezbollah as acceptable. Israel needs to be kept informed and sufficiently satisfied that its security interests are protected in the deal framework. And all of this needs to happen while both sides have fresh missiles in the air and fresh grievances on the table and fresh domestic political pressures pulling against compromise. That is the task in front of the diplomats tonight, and it may be the hardest diplomatic task of this entire 102-day war. America, here's my question for you tonight. Trump called Netanyahu twice in one night and stopped Israel from striking Tehran. Netanyahu halted Israel's attacks for now. But schools are still closed in Israel. Iran is still saying America is responsible for what Israel did. The peace deal has made no tangible progress. And the Lebanon ceasefire loop that keeps driving escalation is still unbroken. Trump bought time with 2 phone calls, but time is not a deal. Here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Trump's decision to call Netanyahu twice and stop the strike on Tehran was the right call, the thing that saved this peace process from complete collapse? Or do you think America should have let Israel hit Tehran and force this war to a decisive conclusion once and for all, even if it meant more missiles, more casualties, and a wider war? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I am reading every single one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This ceasefire is held together tonight by 2 phone calls and a promise of halted for now. Tomorrow, that could change.